Hi, thank you all for coming tonight. Town historian Kathy Ostrander Roberts has been doing this series of local history with us since most of the pandemic. And so
Are you picking me yet?
if you missed any of the previous episodes, they're all up on KFL's YouTube channel. Tonight is going to be History of Kennebunk's Churches, and then we have one more next week. We'll be talking about statues and memorials for veterans. So Kathy, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being out tonight. It's a gorgeous night and you're outside and here you are with me, but thank you very much. Tonight we're talking about I shouldn't say the history of churches as much as it is going to be a talk about what churches there are in Kennebunk and when they were created. And I won't be getting into theology or any kind of thing like that. It's mostly about the needs of the community and when things came about and the architecture. So with that said, I will get started. I always do a little PowerPoint sort of thing here, and let me get it going for us. Can everybody see that screen?
No, can't see it, Kathy.
Can't see it? Okay, hold on just a second. Let's see if we can get it better. Share screen. I'm always so bad at this. I should think I'd get a lot better. Okay, hold on. How about now?
We can see it now. Yep.
Woo-hoo. Okay, so let's get started on this. I just, this is kind of just an ad hoc landing page, but I thought it was kind of neat to show some of the beautiful stained glass windows. People really don't appreciate them so much anymore. These are actually in the old church in Alewife that is no longer open to the public, and they're just gorgeous examples of early art, and it's a shame that they're languishing in the backgrounds and forgotten, but I just thought they were beautiful, so I thought I'd share them. Tonight we're going to start, I see Reverend Lara is with us and she can chime in, but we're starting with the Second Parish Meeting House. Kennebunk, as most people know or are familiar with, was part of Wells, and all the way up until 1820. And Kennebunk and Wells were part of Massachusetts up until that year as well. And the initial starting of commerce and business was started down right around the 1750s at the Landing. Because that was the better river. The Kennebunk River was a better river for navigation and building ships. So things started out with a lot of the populations centered around the Landing. Now you have to remember when people wanted to worship in those days, they came from great distances in the 1750s, and roads were kind of suggestions. They weren't really what we think of now as roads. And meeting houses were austere and unheated, so you can kind of think of yourself sitting in a January in an unheated building for most of the day listening to a sermon, and I can't conjure up much worse than that, but that's what was done. And our first meeting house was built at the Landing kind of just before you go over Durrell's Bridge. And it was consecrated in 1750, and its first minister was a man named Reverend Daniel Little, who stayed on board as that minister for many years. It didn't last that long. By I'll just go to this. By 1771, the community was changing and growing, and it was decided that the congregation had really outgrown the space, and that plus the towns was shifting its town center more towards what is now considered the town center, or the Main Street kind of section of town. So in 1774, in that 1773, 74, they decided that they would dismantle the old church down at the Landing meeting house, and they would build it anew in the place it is now sits, and that was on land that was donated by Captain Joseph Storer. And originally it was 2 stories high, and you had open galleries on either side. And it wasn't until well, it wasn't until 1838 until they divided it into two, they floored over the first section, so you actually had two sections instead of the open concept. In 1803, it was decided that we had needed to enlarge it yet again, so it was cut in the middle, right down the middle, gable-wise, and it was separated and about 28 feet added to it. And it was enlarged at that point. And when you think of it, it didn't originally start out with a steeple. It didn't have a bell tower, any of that. And it didn't have that until that 1803 changeover, when they, a man named Eaton designed the church to have its tower that we now are, we all recognize now. It was in 1803, after it was enlarged, it was painted white. It originally was yellow. I'm not sure what kind of yellow, but I've seen some colonial yellows that are kind of a mustard color. And I wonder, in so many different renovations over the years of that church, if any of that color has ever survived, under some of the clapboards. But needless to say, in 1804, after the steeple was put on the church, the Paul Revere and Sons bell was added, and there's varying accounts of it being one of only 23 or 26 Paul Revere bells left in existence in main churches. And in 1805, it was also when in that steeple a seating area was built for the recently freed people of color. We had a community here in Kennebunk off of the high street of at least a dozen individuals of color, and in 1805, it was decided that it would be perfect for them to have their own place to be part of the community and part of this church. So they made them their own loft. And as I said again, in 1838, they floored over the first level and created, they got rid of that open kind of concept. And then you had actually two floors. And the clock didn't show up until 1859. These are just some great old photographs of the church. You'll notice that gentleman's kneeling in the foreground. He's working on the town water pump that used to sit out front there. And there was a kind of a little podium there. People would commonly go there and, give speeches and so on and so forth. The house next door was owned by a local merchant named Osborne, and it was taken down and moved down to Grove Street when the library was built. So it was repurposed. Here's a neat picture of the Paul Revere and Son bell, created in 1803, installed in 1804. This is when they were doing a lot of the renovations on the inside of the steeple area upstairs. And I was very privileged to get to go up there on a number of occasions with Stacy Wentworth, and I always wondered how many people have actually ever had the opportunity to see what it looks like from up there, and it is quite the sight. When you're up in the interior, you can also see a lot of the amazing old timbers. A lot of them are notched with Roman numerals to indicate where they were put together and intended to sit. And it's just a behind the scenes kind of look at the Unitarian Church's interior. The Unitarian Church, for all of those years, through 1750, all the way up to the first town hall being built, was the center of all things in Kennebunk. It wasn't just a house of worship. It was where any important news was broadcast from the steps. It was also where all of the town meetings were held. And so it was really central to the town. There is a story that upon the close of the Revolution, when the proclamation was read that the war had ended, the bell from this steeple rang, and people could hear it all the way to Alfred. Now, I kind of don't know if that could be possibly true, but who knows? Who knows? Also, if you go into the bell tower, you think of today, you think of graffiti on trains, and you think of kids, you know, in graffiti. And I'm getting, as I get older, I get less tolerant. I sound more and more like my mother, and I go, oh, look at that, that's so ugly, blah, blah, blah. But you know, every generation had it. It's nothing new. And if you look on the plaster that still stands on the walls in the bell tower, graffiti actually goes back quite a ways. There was one gentleman who noted deaths and births, and there's dates all the way back into the 1860s up there. And I just thought it was kind of interesting that everybody kind of wanted to immortalize themselves in a way through some of the graffiti. And then when they were repainting the interior of the bell tower, they stripped it all down into the wood, and interestingly enough, found the most earliest types of graffiti. They weren't drawn on, obviously, with pen and ink in those days. They were actually carved right into the wood, and some of those names are as early as 1844. There were a couple of very prominent men, William Thompson, who signed it. Reverend Edis actually carved his name up there, and it's just kind of fascinating to see, you know, at the early dates when everybody's still trying to leave their mark. This gentleman in the picture is Stacy Wentworth, who is a big part of the church and how it's been preserved to date. He's a big part of that, and a great guy. So they had a bit of a kerfuffle, I would call it. I think that's maybe the best way to say it. About 1817, the church in Wells, the Congregational Church in Wells, employed a minister named Greenleaf, and his views seemed to really be very, very different from those that were currently held by the sitting reverend at Unitarian Church, which at that time wasn't called Unitarian Church. Reverend Nathaniel Fletcher was in charge at that time, and he and Greenleaf apparently had quite the differing of opinions. And like I said, from a theological standpoint, I don't know what they were. I just know that it caused a rift, and this church was built on Dane Street. Dane Street was originally called Union Street, and it was built for those people who kind of had changed their thoughts on or taken a new path with their religion, and they decided that they wanted to start their own congregation of Orthodox congregation, and they built this on Dane Street in 1828. It was started. About that time is, I believe, when the Unitarian Society also, the First Parish Church was then started to be called the Unitarian Church, and it was just those two different types of congregational beliefs. One was Unitarian and one was Orthodox, and you'll have to do more reading on that to understand, or maybe even Lara can fill us in at the end if she feels like a victim, she might, on what those differences were that caused this second church to be built. So we're kind of going in order of when churches came into being in Kennebunk. So we started with the first, the parish church, and now we have this one on Dane Street. It is now called Christ Church. In 1847, actually before 1847, there was a Baptist church out in Alewife, and it was torn down after disuse. And this one was built in 1847 for what were called the Free Will Baptists. And a lot of why they built this church wasn't as much about differing opinions from the churches in the town center as much as it was just an inconvenience to ride your horse all the way from Alewife down to the middle of town. And so they you know, a group of people organized in that section of town, the Taylors and the Mitchells and so on and so forth, and decided to build the Free Will Baptist Church. I don't know, this is a picture of the interior of it when it was owned by a gentleman named Bill Johnson. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Bill. He had a passion for collecting things, and he kind of loaded this church up with various things that I don't know if they were true to the church so much as they were just things that he found along the way and put them in the church. But it's a sweet little place. It's quaint. For a while, Mary Zachary Lang and others were allowed to do services there and do private ceremonies. But since Bill's passing of late, I'm not really sure what the idea or what will become of this church. At one time, Bill Johnson wanted to move it to his Johnson Museum on Route 1, but I think the uproar he got from the community made him change his mind, and it's still there, and it's a lovely little church. The next church chronologically to come on board, even though the one in LY was 1847, this was called the Methodist Church, and right now it's a house and it's for sale, and it's right across from the Hope Cemetery. It started out as a Methodist church. It swapped at one time, I believe, to Episcopalian, and it also at one time was a Presbyterian church. More recently, like 40 years ago, it was a Presbyterian church. And then probably, I want to say 4 years ago or so, somebody went in and bought it, took out all the pews and turned it into a home and a rental property. And I'm told that it's for sale if anybody's looking for an unusual property. Now the bell in this church, just one of those little known facts, as Norm would say, the bell from this church now sits on the yard next to the church house, and it came from the old Union Academy that was at the base of Dane Street when that was burned down. Next, we come to this really odd-looking church I just love. One of the earliest pictures of it, probably on the left, taken about 1860. And it was built in what we call a Carpenter Gothic style, Gothic Revival style, very much influenced by churches in England. And it was built at a cost of $4,000 in 1840. I read recently today that there's a time capsule under the cornerstone that has documents and paraphernalia from 1840s, and I'm not sure that anybody has investigated that over the years, but I think it'd be fun to find out more about that. West Kennebunk. I always think of this church as the place where the bean suppers happen. It was also a Methodist church, and it was built in 1868, and Reverend Israel Downing, whose house was out there, an ancestor actually of John Downing, who's just passed, one of his great-great-grandparents, built this in 1868 for the area of West Kennebunk, because again, it was easier to travel to this vicinity. And I think, as it says, there was only at that time about 25 persons using it. I'm not sure how many still worship there today, but it is still an active part of the community. Around 1890, we had a huge influx of Scandinavians and Norwegians who came here to work in the mills, at the shoe factories and the cotton. We had actually a cotton mill at one point. We had all kinds of mills along the river, and the Scandinavians, we had the Leatheroid mill, and the Scandinavians people came, and they wanted to worship their faith, which I believe was Lutheran at the time. And so they, in 1895, they constructed a church on Hall Street, which if you drive by, you automatically get it that was a church at one time. You can see the silhouette of the arched windows and some of the stained glass, and the entrance for the men and the entrance for the women. That too has been changed and turned into a house, and it still stands. Another church was built later, and I'm not sure if it was from the same group of individuals, but this was their first church, and The cemetery next door to this, behind this, Mount Pleasant, is filled with many of those early Kennebunk workers. The next church was built in 1905 on Storer Street by carpenters Jonas and Clark. And I believe, and this could be wrong, but I think that William Berry had something to do with the design of this. And it was the Catholic Church all the way up until they built St. Monica's, now St. Martha's, up on Route 1 in 1968. So this was there for 63 years on Storer Street as a Catholic church, and it is now a Lutheran church. This one has been a lot of things. It, again, is, you can tell from the spires on the top that it was built in that Carpenter Gothic Revival kind of style. This is in Lower Village, kind of across from Pedro's, a little bit up. It was a small community church for most of the people who lived and worked at the Landing, and it was called the Advent Society Church. In my history of being in town 30 years, I have never seen it as a church. So it must have changed over many years ago. I know that when I first came here, it was a clothing store. And then most recently, and for quite a while now, it's been a surfboard shop, and, you know, Surfing Alcoholics it's called. So it's kind of neat to see what it originally started out as, and see that we're trying to repurpose our houses much like our Yankee ancestors did, I guess. Personally, if I'm going to vent my little opinion, I think it's, you know, it's tragic that churches become houses, but then it would be more tragic if we lost them altogether. St. Monica's was built in 1968. They took the name from the Catholic church that they had on Storer Street, and it carried the name of St. Monica's for quite a while. I recall probably, you know, into the 1980s and 90s, and then they renamed it St. Martha's. And it again has been around since 1968, and recently had a tree come down in the parking lot, which luckily didn't cause any damage in that last windstorm. And the most recent of all is the St. David's Episcopal Church, which, as most of you know, sits up on Route 1, kind of as you're heading out of the town to the Water District and to Wells. And that's chronologically, that's the most recent of all. And so that's pretty much the capsule summary. There's only about 12 churches in town. There are none there are no, I'm trying to think what the word is. It's kind of like a mixture of Lutheran, Catholic, Baptist, Methodist. There are you know, I think the Second Congregational Society in Wells, which, you know, came around to be the Unitarian Church eventually, is the most storied, obviously, of all, and the most prominent and most visible in our town. There is a church that I have found very little about. It's on the Landing. It's called the Landing Chapel, and I would love to know more about it. A friend of mine, Dickie Going, used to go to it, and I failed to pick his brains on it, but if anybody wants to tell me a little bit about it, that's probably the last one I can think of that is around. So that's the story. That's what all of our churches in town.
I've changed the settings so you can all unmute yourselves if you have questions or comments.
Sure, if anybody knows about the Landing Chapel, let me know. Reverend Lara, do you want to add anything tonight about your Unitarian church?
Sure. So,
hello again, by the way.
Hello. I know it's been a while.
Yeah.
So basically, what happened is that the rift between the Wells minister,
yeah,
and Reverend Fletcher was really around theology. At that point, many of the congregational churches in New England were starting to adopt a Unitarian theology, meaning that rather than the Trinitarian, which is God is three, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, it was that God was one and that God could not be separated. Jesus,
Okay.
it could not be separated into three parts. And that was the primary rift. And so what happened was that because of congregational polity, each church gets to decide its own theology, its own approach. They call their own ministers, they make all their own decisions. And so the congregation voted in 1826 to follow Fletcher's lead on the Unitarian theology.
And those who didn't agree with that split off to go to create the
Correct.
Dane Street Church, which would be an Orthodox sort of
Well, I think Orthodox in terms of the fact that they stayed Trinitarian. Yes.
Right.
Well,
good. I thought I kind of got there. I wasn't sure. So.
Yeah, you were right there. You were right there.
I don't know if Lara, with COVID, obviously not a lot happens along these lines, but eventually, if we get back to some sort of a semblance of normalcy, if you reach out to Reverend Lara, she may or may not allow you to toddle up the bell tower and see these wonderful things that exist up there. And it is really wonderful, tangible history. And if she likes you, she'll probably not ring the bell in your ear when you're right next to it. And like I did to my husband.
I would be delighted to take people on a tour.
It's so fascinating. It is.
It is absolutely fascinating to go, not only just in the bell tower, but just around the building and to see.
Oh, I know.
The fact that
those drawings are there of the original, how it looked, and it is a fascinating part of our history.
And because we were the original library, so our the church library was the predecessor to the town library. So
Reverend Lara and I spent a good amount of time digging through her archives in the basement, and it's fascinating to see the town meeting sort of workings because they were all carried on there. So it's lovely that those documents still exist, and you can still see invoices for when they were building the pew for the persons of color, and it's just fascinating. I just loved it. Thanks for the trip down that world. Anybody else have any questions?
I'll have a comment. When you were showing and talking about Union Church, Christ Church on Dane Street, when I came to this area, immediately I recognized the belfry. There's a duplicate belfry at West Parish Church in Andover, Massachusetts.
Oh, so they got their inspiration.
So I wonder if the building might have been actually the same architect. Or maybe they had some sort of a church architectural guidebook of that era that you could kind of say, okay, we're going to pick out this kind of church.
Yeah, I wonder as well, because when I was trying to figure out the inspiration behind the Baptist Church on Main Street, what they call the Carpenter Gothic era, there are many of those in Maine, especially with that kind of you're right, maybe there was here's a plan for churches and you can pick the kind that really represents what you want it to look like. When I lived in England, there were a lot of churches that had Gothic kind of look to them, and it's interesting to see that they kind of try to replicate those Gothic churches, but in wood here in New England. So I think some of those design elements definitely came from elsewhere. Well, if there's no more questions, I guess I'll turn it back to Allison.
Thank you, Kathy. This will be posted on our YouTube channel along with all of the others. You can just go right to our webpage, and there's a little link up in the top right-hand corner, the little YouTube icon. So
excellent. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Kathy, actually, it looks like we have one more question.
Oh, okay, yep.
I have a question about, I'm always fascinated with language and so forth, and often I could identify people where they were from simply because of the way they spoke. and I'm interested in the pronunciation of that area of Kennebunk called Alwif.
Alewife.
Alwive.
Yeah, it's, think of, there's a fish, it's called an alewife.
Oh, yes.
Um,
I
but-
grew up with the pronunciation was in my area was Alwif.
Well, here, you'll see it both ways on old maps. You will see it with an F and you will see it with a V. So
Mhm.
I'm sure that that has been battled back and forth here as well.
All right.
There's a question in the chat, Kathy. It says, you said there were 24 Revere bells in existence in Maine. Is that only in Maine or are there more in the country?
That, you know, I've got to look at my notes on that. I think it may be in the country, you know, to tell the truth. And another little bit of
Yes,
information.
it is.
What's that?
There's only 23 functional bells left in the country.
Yeah, there you go.
Most of them
And
all in New England.
isn't that great? I mean, it's sad, but I mean, so cool that we have one. And also what's a little bit interesting in my world is, and Reverend Lara knows this, we have one of the few surviving hearse houses at the Unitarian Church as well. There's very few of those around anymore. So all underneath, all here in town, just walk to it. You can, now with COVID, you can, all these things you can still see, you know, are open to the public. So that's it for me, guys. Thanks so much.